A quick word on this week's partner. Our lives are busy, and it can be hard to wind down and relax at the end of the day. The partner for this video is Feelsy, an app that helps you calm down by using hypnotic visuals and sensory sounds. Listen to the daily meditation with soothing background music and relaxing visuals, and log your mood with the daily diary, or choose from one of their other audio meditation videos. Play with the different slimes to relieve anxiety. As you touch your screen, the slimes react with satisfying ASMR sounds. I particularly like the sea stone slime, which sounds like shingle on a beach. Touch it, feel it, and relax immediately. I've been sleeping better using the relaxing mixes. There's 12 sounds from deep relaxation like wind, rain, and the sound of a campfire, or you can listen to a sleep cast, a short video with deeply hypnotic and healing music. With Feelsy, you have instant stress relief in your pocket, and the slime ASMR is so satisfying. Check my link in the description to give it a go. The time is 1 AM on the 6th of March 1943. Two destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Murasame and Minagumo, are travelling northeast through the Blackett Strait that separates the Pacific islands of Kolombangara and Arundel. The destroyers are en route to their base in the Shortland Islands after dropping off supplies at Munda Airfield, located at the southern tip of Kolombangara. Under the command of Captain Masao Tachibana, Murasame and Minagumo are cruising along at 20 knots as they enter the Kula Gulf. Suddenly, at 1:01 AM, the wailing of incoming shells sends Japanese sailors diving to the deck. A salvo of 5 and 6-inch shells cause plumes of water to erupt around the lead ship, Murasame. Less than 11,000 yards away are 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers of the US Navy under the command of Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill, which have fired a broadside guided by radar-controlled gunnery. The hail of shells continues, while Japanese gunners struggle to train their weaponry at the bright muzzle flashes coming from the east. Before Murasame can return fire, she is straddled by another salvo, which sets the destroyer aflame, while the destroyer USS Waller launches a spread of 10 torpedoes. The warship's burning superstructure attracts more gunfire, and Murasame is pounded into scrap metal within minutes. A torpedo from Waller then smashes into her at 1:15 AM, detonating the magazines and sending the destroyer to the bottom of the Kula Gulf. The American warships quickly shift their target to Minagumo, who is attempting to return fire. The destroyer is immediately bracketed by shell fire and takes several direct hits. The American light cruisers and destroyers make quick work of Minagumo. The second Japanese destroyer is a blazing wreck, and her crew abandons ship. The engagement is over, with both Japanese destroyers sunk after less than 15 minutes of combat. 174 of the 329 Japanese sailors aboard Murasame and Minagumo are killed, with most of the survivors swimming to the safety of Kolombangara. The Battle of Blackett Strait is over, but months of fierce naval battles around the key island of New Georgia have just begun. The New Georgia campaign begins at a critical time in the Pacific War. Less than a month ago, the long and bloody Guadalcanal campaign ended on the 9th of February 1943 with a decisive Allied victory. Guadalcanal is a turning point in the war in the Pacific, as it represents the first time the Allies have gone on the offensive against the Japanese and emerged victorious. The Allies continue their momentum in the region, and on the 21st of February, the US 43rd Infantry Division and the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion land on the nearby Russell Islands as part of Operation Clean Slate. The invasion is unopposed, and the United States quickly establishes a forward operating base on the Russell Islands. However, the capture of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands does not mean the end of fighting in the larger Solomon Islands chain. The key base at Henderson Field continues to be bombed by enemy aircraft operating out of the major Japanese base at Rabaul, as well as from the New Georgia Islands, particularly the air bases at Vila and Munda. The American commanders in the area, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Halsey, decide that the Japanese base at Rabaul must be neutralized to allow for the Allied advance in the South Pacific to continue. Planning begins for Operation Cartwheel, a series of amphibious landings along with naval and air offensive intended to isolate Rabaul and deny its usefulness to the enemy. The first target of Cartwheel will be the New Georgia Islands, which are defended by 10,500 Japanese soldiers and around 160 land-based aircraft. MacArthur and Halsey first attempt to neutralize the Japanese bases on New Georgia through naval bombardment. The American task force which took part in the Battle of Blackett Strait had been on their way to bombard the Japanese airfield at Vila when they crossed paths with the Japanese destroyers. A group of 4 US Navy destroyers also bombarded the airfield at Munda in the early morning darkness of the 6th of March. However, the naval gunfire fails to do much damage to either base. Furthermore, the Japanese garrisons are continuously supplied and reinforced by the Tokyo Express, the American nickname for Japanese naval resupply runs coming down what is referred to as the slot from Rabaul and Bougainville. In May, the US Navy mines the approaches to New Georgia, and although 3 Japanese destroyers are lost to the mines, the Tokyo Express continues operations. The last remaining option for the Allies is to conduct a series of amphibious landings to destroy the Japanese garrisons, a plan codenamed Operation Toenails. The US Navy's Task Force 31, under the command of Rear Admiral Richmond Turner, will land 43,000 American infantry and marines. Once the ground forces are ashore, Turner's task force of cruisers, destroyers and patrol torpedo boats will provide support and attempt to finally cut off the Tokyo Express. One American serviceman who finds himself assigned to support Operation Toenails is Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, the son of a famous American politician and former ambassador to the UK, Joseph P. Kennedy. Despite suffering from chronic physical ailments, the future President Kennedy uses his father's influence to secure a commission in the Navy and arrives in the South Pacific on the 14th of April. 9 days later, he is given command of Patrol Torpedo Boat PT-109 in preparation for the upcoming invasion of New Georgia. This will be Kennedy's first taste of combat. Operation Toenails begins on the 30th of June 1943 with landings on Wendover and the Vangunu Islands. Although both objectives are secured, the American forces on Wendover are subjected to heavy air attacks over the next week, which reinforces the need to destroy the Japanese air bases at Vila and Munda. The next landing is made on the 2nd of July near Munda Airfield, but the terrain here is undeveloped and the assault force must spend days building up infrastructure for an offensive against the island. The next phase of the operation begins on the 5th of July with a landing on the northern coast of New Georgia to block Japanese reinforcements from Kolombangara from reaching Munda over land. The landing will be supported by Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth's Task Group 36.1, comprising 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. At 12:30 am, the destroyers USS Strong and Nicholas enter Beroko Harbour and begin bombarding Japanese defences in preparation for the amphibious landing by the 1st Marine Raider Regiment further to the northeast. The destroyers fire for 10 minutes straight before withdrawing out of the harbour to allow the destroyers Chevalier and O'Bannon to take their place. At 12:49 am, an explosion suddenly rocks USS Strong's port side, and the destroyer immediately begins listing heavily. The quick-thinking captain of the Chevalier immediately rams the bow of the USS Strong, allowing men to clamber over from their stricken warship. However, Japanese shore batteries begin bombarding the 2 destroyers, firing star shells into the night sky, followed by heavy artillery. The USS O'Bannon returns fire while Chevalier rescues 241 survivors from Strong. Rear Admiral Ainsworth is convinced a Japanese submarine managed to launch a torpedo from close range before retreating undetected, but the USS Strong has actually been the victim of a Japanese destroyer. At 12:35 am, the Japanese destroyer Nitsuki fired a spread of 4 long-lance torpedoes from 11 nautical miles or 20 kilometers away. It took 14 minutes for the torpedo, which struck USS Strong, to find its mark, making Nitsuki's attack the longest successful torpedo strike in history. At 1:24 am, Strong's depth charges begin detonating, and the destroyer sinks with the loss of 46 men. The rest of the US warships retreat from Beroko Harbour, while the 1st Marine Raider Regiment lands at Rice Anchorage without facing resistance. Rear Admiral Ainsworth's task group initially sets course for the Coral Sea to resupply, but is recalled in the mid-afternoon by Admiral Halsey. Allied coast watchers stationed at remote outposts throughout the Solomon Islands have alerted Halsey that the Japanese will attempt another Tokyo Express supply run on the night of the 5th to the 6th of June. Halsey orders Ainsworth to intercept and destroy the enemy force. Task Group 36.1 turns around and heads back for New Georgia, arriving at Visu Visu Point just after midnight. The American task group lies in wait off the east coast of Kolombangara, with Rear Admiral Ainsworth placing his 3 Brooklyn-class light cruisers, Helena, St. Louis and Honolulu, in the center of his formation, to blanket the Japanese naval force with radar-aimed 5 and 6-inch shells. Meanwhile, the destroyers USS Nicholas, O'Bannon, Radford and Jenkins will act in a supporting role and finish off the enemy survivors once they have been disabled by shell fire. Coming towards them are 10 Japanese destroyers split into 3 groups under the command of Rear Admiral Teruo Akiyama. The naval group is carrying 2,600 men along with much needed supplies for Munda and Vila. Akiyama's flagship, Nitsuki, had fired the torpedo which struck USS Strong and is one of the rare Japanese destroyers equipped with surface search radar. At 1:06 am, Nitsuki's radar picks up American radar signals, indicating that US Navy ships are operating nearby. Rear Admiral Akiyama's plan is to pass by the western edge of Kolombangara, detach a group of 3 destroyers to offload their cargo at Vila, and then lead the rest of his group into the Kula Gulf. Once the first group has finished offloading, the second transport group will repeat the process. Meanwhile, Akiyama's support unit will provide escort and protection. The first group of 3 Japanese destroyers was detached to land troops and supplies at Vila at 12:26 am. The American surface radar in Task Group 36.1 identifies the remaining Japanese ships in the Kula Gulf at 1:40 am, and Rear Admiral Ainsworth moves his warships towards Kolombangara to close the gap. 3 minutes later, Akiyama detaches his second group of destroyers, while his column is shadowed by the American task group lurking to the northeast. Believing he is about to lose his opportunity to destroy the entire enemy naval force, Ainsworth orders commence firing at 1:54 am. 3 minutes later, the cruisers Honolulu, Helena and St. Louis open up with their main batteries from 6,800 yards out. The Nitsuki is their main target, and Rear Admiral Akiyama's flagship is quickly bracketed by shellfire. Within minutes, she is struck by 45 6-inch and 12 5-inch shells and is set aflame. The destroyer attempts to swing her torpedo tubes out to starboard for an attack, but the weight of American gunfire is too much. By 2 am, she is a flaming wreck, and Rear Admiral Akiyama is dead. However, the American task group has been too focused on Nitsuki and has neglected the 2 trailing destroyers, Suzukaze and Tanikaze. These 2 warships launch a spread of 16 long-lance torpedoes, aiming at the USS Helena. Helena had expended her flashless gunpowder during the preemptive bombardment the previous night, forcing her crew to switch to a more visible powder. At 2:03 am, a torpedo strikes Helena in between her number 1 and 2 turrets, nearly blowing off the bow. 2 minutes later, she is hit by 2 more torpedoes amidships, which break the ship's keel. Captain Charles Cecil orders the crew to abandon ship as Helena falls out of formation and begins to sink. The USS St. Louis is also hit by a torpedo that proves to be a dud. By now, the remaining American warships have switched targets and are lobbing shells at the remaining Japanese destroyers. Suzukaze and Tanikaze run to the north, hugging the shoreline of Kolombangara while laying smoke to cover their withdrawal. A handful of 6-inch shells find their targets, but the Japanese destroyers take minor damage and successfully escape the area. The Japanese second transport group is also taking fire from Task Group 36.1. The destroyers Nagatsuki and Satsuki are running to the south when Nagatsuki takes a single 6-inch shell which blasts a large hole in her hull. With the ship quickly taking on water, her captain runs aground just off Kolambangara to allow her to offload the Japanese soldiers. With the Japanese destroyers widely dispersed and fleeing the area, the battle begins to wind down at 2:27 am. 3 minutes later, the USS Helena sinks with the loss of 168 men killed out of her crew of 888. Rear Admiral Ainsworth remains in the area for the next hour before retiring towards Tulagi at 3:30 am. 3 American destroyers remain behind to pick up survivors from Helena and occasionally clash with the Japanese destroyer Amagiri. At 5 am, the USS Nicholas lands 4 5-inch shells on Amagiri, finally forcing her to retreat from the area. The grounded Nagatsuki manages to offload her supplies until she is found by American aircraft and destroyed by Dauntless dive bombers at just past 10 am. By noon on the 6th of July, both forces have left the area. The Battle of Kula Gulf is inconclusive. The US Navy has lost the light cruiser Helena, while 2 Japanese destroyers have been sunk and another 2 damaged, with the loss of 324 men. However, 1,600 Japanese troops and 90 tons of supplies have been successfully landed at Vila, and the Tokyo Express is still in operation. Despite the loss of Helena, Rear Admiral Ainsworth believes he has dealt a major defeat to the Japanese, and is eager for another fight. American PT boats have established a temporary base on Rendover Island. They patrol the waters around New Georgia every night to disrupt Tokyo Express traffic to Vila and Munda. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy's PT-109 is among those small craft which undertake these dangerous patrols, which often end in bloody naval combat with Japanese warships. Meanwhile, the ground campaign to take Munda is proceeding much slower than expected. Difficult terrain, poor logistics and overcautious leadership have slowed the Allied advance to a crawl, meaning the US Navy will continue to bear the brunt of fighting as they try to stop the Tokyo Express. On the evening of the 12th of July, Allied coast watchers report a large Japanese resupply run coming down the slot towards Kolambangara. This force is commanded by Rear Admiral Shunji Isaka and is composed of the light cruiser Jinsu, 5 destroyers and 4 destroyers converted into fast transports. They are to land 1,200 troops at Via before returning to Rabaul. It is the largest Tokyo Express run since the Battle of Kula Gulf, and Rear Admiral Ainsworth immediately moves newly formed Task Force 18 to intercept. The light cruisers Honolulu and St. Louis are joined by the Royal New Zealand Navy light cruiser HMNZS Leander, along with 10 destroyers. Task Force 18 leaves Tulagi at 5 PM and heads for the same location where the American warships ambushed the Japanese force at Kula Gulf a week earlier. At 12:35 am on the morning of the 13th of July, a PBY Catalina scout aircraft spots the Japanese resupply force and alerts Rear Admiral Ainsworth. Ainsworth deploys his task force in roughly the same manner he did on the 6th of July, with 5 destroyers in the lead, the 3 light cruisers in the centre of the formation, and 5 destroyers bringing up the rear. His plan this time is slightly different. Once the enemy is within range, his lead destroyers will fire a spread of torpedoes before his main cruisers open fire with their main batteries. After the initial barrage of naval gunfire, his cruisers will maneuver away from the Japanese destroyers before they can launch their torpedoes. His rear destroyers will then move in to engage the enemy. Believing he will catch the Japanese unaware, Ainsworth is confident he can wipe out the Tokyo Express on this night. Unfortunately for Ainsworth, his assumption that he will have complete surprise in the coming engagement couldn't be further from the truth. Rear Admiral Isaka's advance force detected radar pulses on their radio sets beginning at 11 PM on the 12th of July, and his naval plotters are able to chart an accurate disposition for the Allied task force before they enter the area around Kula Gulf. At 12:57 am, Isaka is informed by a Japanese scout aircraft that the Allied warships are approaching. 3 minutes later, the Allies detect Isaka's force on radar, and Rear Admiral Ainsworth orders his formation to pick up speed and prepare to engage the enemy. However, the task force can only move as fast as its slowest ship, HMNZS Leander, which is only able to make 28 knots. By comparison, the Japanese force is also preparing to engage, travelling at 30 knots. Rear Admiral Isaka detaches the 4 converted destroyer transports to make a run for Via, while his crews prepare to launch torpedoes. The slightly faster Japanese force attains visual contact at 1:08 am, and the light cruiser Jinsu, along with the destroyers Mikazuki, Yukikaze, Hamikaze, Kiyonami, and Yogure, fire a spread of 29 torpedoes. Having also achieved visual contact, the US Navy destroyers Nicholas, O'Bannon, and Taylor fire off 19 torpedoes 2 minutes later. However, the American Mark 15 torpedoes are inferior to the Japanese Long Lances and have a much shorter range. None of them will hit their target. At 1:12 am, the lead destroyer USS Nicholas engages Jinsu with her 5-inch guns at a range of 10,000 yards. Jinsu responds by training her searchlight on Nicholas to illuminate her, but Rear Admiral Ainsworth's cruisers now have a large target to train their 6-inch guns on. Honolulu, St. Louis, and Leander open fire and immediately score hits on Jinsu's rudder, disabling her steering. The next salvo smashes directly into the bridge, killing Rear Admiral Isaka and most of his staff. The helpless Jinsu is pummeled by shellfire for the next 3 minutes, and at 1:14 am, the 5 destroyers in the rear, along with the torpedo-equipped Leander, fire off a spread of 21 torpedoes. Rear Admiral Ainsworth orders his warships to shift their fire away from the devastated Jinsu and on to the Japanese destroyers, which have gone unscathed so far. However, the spread of Long Lance torpedoes are now spotted heading for the Allied warships. Ainsworth orders his cruisers to take evasive action, but the hastily thrown together Task Force 18 has never practiced this manoeuvre as a unit before. The once tight and orderly formation disintegrates into chaos as most ships turn wide to avoid collisions. At 1:22 am, HMNZS Leander takes a torpedo on the port bow, which kills 28 men and floods a boiler room. The wounded light cruiser falls out of formation, while the destroyers Radford and Jenkins come alongside to help with repairs. The naval battle now descends into confusion, as drifting smoke and nighttime conditions make identification difficult. Rear Admiral Ainsworth orders USS Honolulu to launch a float aircraft and search for the enemy, while he reforms his task force, now without 2 destroyers and a light cruiser. At 1:38 am, Honolulu's float aircraft reports 4 Japanese destroyers attempting to retreat out of Kula Bay to the northwest, and Ainsworth decides to give chase. The American force has become spread out, and only 2 light cruisers along with the destroyer Gwyn end up pursuing the enemy. The rest of Ainsworth's ships are still pummeling the hapless Jinsu, or have taken themselves out of the battle, trying to avoid Japanese torpedoes. Unbeknownst to Ainsworth, the Japanese destroyers he thinks are retreating are actually doubling back to launch another torpedo attack. At 1:45 am, the Jinsu blows up after taking a torpedo from an American destroyer. She sinks 3 minutes later, taking 482 men to the bottom. Meanwhile, Honolulu, St. Louis, and Gwyn are stumbling right into a trap. Honolulu's radar picks up contacts approaching from the northwest at 1:56 am, but Rear Admiral Ainsworth is unsure whether they are friend or foe. He and his staff spend the next 7 minutes hailing each warship individually to find out their position while the radar contacts come closer. At 2:03 am, the American light cruisers fire off star shells to identify the potential targets. The glow of artificial light reveals 4 Japanese destroyers turning to the northwest, and Ainsworth orders his warships to starboard to unmask their main batteries. This move places Honolulu, St. Louis, and Gwyn directly in the path of 31 Long Lance torpedoes. The 3 American warships open fire, but the Japanese destroyers are already retreating after launching the torpedoes. At 2:08 am, USS Honolulu signals the rest of the task force. "Torpedo just passed us." and the St. Louis, along with Gwin, begin taking evasive maneuvers. Seconds later, both Honolulu and St. Louis take direct hits. St. Louis's bow is left a twisted wreck, while Honolulu is struck by one torpedo, which collapses the bow section, and another amidships, which proves to be a dud. Yet there are no casualties aboard either ship, thanks in part to swift damage control. USS Gwin is not so fortunate. At 2:14 AM, her engine room is struck by a torpedo that leaves the destroyer dead in the water. The destroyer, the USS Ralph Talbot, rushes to aid the stricken Gwin, and fires her own spread of torpedoes at the Japanese warships. These score no hits. The Japanese torpedo action is the last action of the Battle of Kolombangara, as both sides try to regroup in the early hours. This is a dangerous time for Task Force 18. With HMNZS Leander crippled and USS Gwin taking on water, both ships will be targets for enemy aircraft once the sun rises. Ainsworth contacts Rear Admiral Turner to ask for maximum air cover at daybreak to cover his warships as they withdraw back towards their safe harbour in Tulagi. Sure enough, 18 Japanese Val dive bombers escorted by 20 Zero fighters take off from Bougainville and fly down the slot to attack Task Force 18. However, they are met and driven off by American fighters based out of the Russell Islands and Guadalcanal, before they can spot the disabled US Navy and Royal New Zealand Navy warships. Despite desperate damage control efforts, USS Gwin sinks at 9:30 AM with the loss of 61 men. Although the Imperial Japanese Navy has lost the light cruiser Jinsu, the Battle of Kolombangara is a Japanese victory. The Japanese destroyer transports have succeeded in delivering 1,200 men to Via, along with their supplies. Despite the loss of Jinsu, the Japanese destroyers have knocked out 3 Allied light cruisers and sunk an American destroyer. The battle laid bare flaws in Rear Admiral Ainsworth's tactics, and the continued superiority of the Japanese long-lance torpedo. Dismayed by the battles of Kula Gulf and Kolombangara, where the Allies have lost 4 light cruisers to torpedoes, Ainsworth, Admiral Halsey, and US Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester Nimitz agree that cruisers will no longer be used to intercept Tokyo express runs. They are not fast enough to keep up with Japanese destroyers, and have proven exceedingly vulnerable to torpedoes. From now on, aircraft, destroyers and PT boats will become the primary weapon for stopping enemy resupply convoys. Meanwhile, the land campaign on New Georgia continues to be a sluggish affair. By the 15th of July, units of the US 43rd Infantry Division and 9th Marine Battalion have reached the main Japanese defensive line around Munda Airfield, but the advance is still plagued with difficulties. Hoping to gain the upper hand on New Georgia, the Imperial Navy launches a large reinforcement effort on the 19th of July, this time with destroyer transports escorted by 3 heavy cruisers. However, this run is intercepted by American TBF Avengers flying out of Guadalcanal. 2 destroyers are sunk by the air attack, and the heavy cruiser Kumano and another destroyer are damaged. The heavy defeat on the night of the 19th of July, combined with the losses suffered at the battles of Bucket Strait, Kula Gulf and Kolombangara, is slowly sapping the Imperial Navy of their strength in an attritional campaign similar to Guadalcanal. Nevertheless, the Japanese High Command continue to funnel reinforcements down the slot, including increased use of Daihatsu barges. The fleet of American PT boats, which has built up on Rendover Island, is taking on a larger responsibility as the battle for New Guinea intensifies. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy and the crew of PT 109 have been living in squalor ever since they arrived in the Solomons. The makeshift base at Rendover is infested with cockroaches, rats, mosquitoes, and a number of dangerous parasites. Kennedy himself will contract malaria and suffer from its after effects for years. On the night of the 19th of July, PT 109 is bombed and strafed by a Japanese fighter, with the crew barely escaping with their lives. Yet, the PT boats continue to play a key role in the naval campaign, patrolling the Blackett Strait, and provide early warning when Japanese warships make their resupply runs down the slot. In an effort to eliminate the PT boat threat, 18 enemy bombers attacked the Wendover Island base on the 1st of August. One boat is destroyed and another damaged, but the fleet as a whole remains intact. In fact, the raid is a preemptive strike to clear the way for another Tokyo Express run, consisting of 4 destroyers, to take place later this night. The commander of the PT boats on Wendover, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Warfield, gathers his skippers and orders every seaworthy vessel to sortie in force to intercept incoming Japanese destroyers. 15 PT boats are gathered for the effort and split into 4 groups, with each assigned a specific area to patrol near the Blackett Strait and the south coast of Kolombangara. 7 US Navy destroyers will patrol the northern coast of the island, ensuring that one of the task forces will intercept the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyers. The 4 vessels of Division B have the longest distance to cover and leave Wendover at 6:30 PM, with Lieutenant John F. Kennedy at the helm of the last boat in line. This will be the final voyage of his PT-109. If you don't want to wait for part 2, it's available right now to watch on our Patreon, completely ad and sponsor free. You can support the channel by joining for as little as $5 a month.